Summer of 1916. The Western Front was frozen in agonizing anticipation. 2 years of bloody battles had transformed the once flourishing fields of France into a lunar landscape of craters, barbed wire, and endless trenches. Verdun was bleeding under German strikes, and the Entente command was preparing a response of unprecedented scale. The Somme River Valley was to become the site of a decisive breakthrough, which, as the British and French generals hoped, would end the positional stalemate. General Haig assembled an army of 600,000 men, many of them volunteers, barely trained. They believed in a quick victory. Facing them were fortified German positions, where every bunker had been turned into an impregnable fortress. The German command knew about the impending strike, but could not withdraw troops from Verdun. Clouds gathered over the Somme Valley, where one of the bloodiest dramas in human history would soon unfold. None of the soldiers cleaning their rifles in the trenches imagined the price that would be paid for every meter of this land. In early 1916, the Entente High Command gathered for a historic conference in Chantilly. General Douglas Haig, recently appointed commander of the British Expeditionary Force, and Marshal Joseph Joffre, commander-in-chief of the French army, bent over maps. Their fingers stopped at the winding line of the Somme River. It was here they decided to strike a blow that, in their conception, was to break the back of the German defenses. The initial plan envisioned a large-scale Franco-British offensive with equal participation from both countries' forces. However, when the Germans launched their operation at Verdun in February, everything changed. French divisions were transferred one after another into the inferno of Verdun, and the main burden of the upcoming offensive fell on the shoulders of the British, mostly unblooded volunteers from Kitchener's army. General Haig, a cavalryman of the old school, believed in a decisive breakthrough. His plan was built on overwhelming artillery superiority. 7 days of continuous fire were supposed to destroy German fortifications, grind barbed wire, and demoralize the enemy. After that, the infantry would simply march through the ruined positions, encountering almost no resistance. French General Ferdinand Foch, commanding the northern group of French armies, was less optimistic. Having experienced the bloody battles of the early years of the war, he insisted on a more cautious approach, proposing to advance with short but precise strikes, consolidating each success. A fatal mistake was the overestimation of artillery capabilities. British generals genuinely believed that their thousands of guns would sweep away everything in their path. They did not take into account that the Germans had created a system of deep echeloned defenses with concrete shelters, where soldiers could weather the bombardment up to 9 meters underground. Another miscalculation was the offensive tactics. Soldiers were ordered to advance in even lines, with heavy equipment, at a slow pace. This decision, made due to distrust of the combat qualities of the recruits, turned the attacking formations into ideal targets for German machine gunners. The German command, receiving intelligence about the impending strike, methodically strengthened its defenses. General Erich von Falkenhayn, understanding the importance of holding positions, ordered the creation of 3 lines of defense with concrete bunkers, underground galleries, and interlocking sectors of machine gun fire. Each village was turned into a fortress, each height into an impregnable bastion. On June 24, 1916, at 4 o'clock in the morning, a deafening roar shattered the silence over the Somme Valley. 1,500 British guns opened fire on German positions. The earth trembled. The most powerful artillery barrage the world had ever seen had begun. For 7 days and 7 nights without interruption, British artillerymen sent shell after shell towards the enemy fortifications. During this time, over 1,600,000 shells were fired, more than during the entire first year of the war. The sky over the Somme was shrouded in smoke. The roar of the cannonade was audible even in London, 300 kilometers from the front line. In the front line trenches, British soldiers watched this apocalyptic spectacle with enthusiasm. Quote, wrote young Lieutenant Wilfred Owen in his diary, quote, "The Allied artillery park included all types of guns, from light 75mm field guns to giant 380mm naval guns, specially brought from ships. Howitzers, capable of indirect fire and hitting targets deep within the defense, played a special role. According to General Haig's plan, the artillery was to accomplish 3 key tasks: destroy German fortifications, break through multi-layered barbed wire entanglements, and suppress enemy strongpoints, especially machine gun nests. However, by the 3rd day of the bombardment, British observers began to notice alarming signs. Shell explosions created huge craters, but German bunkers, built of reinforced concrete and dug several meters into the ground, remained intact. Barbed wire, instead of being cut into pieces, in many places merely became tangled, turning into an even more impassable obstacle. The main problem was the quality of the ammunition. Almost a third of the shells failed to explode upon impact with soft ground. British industry, rapidly increasing the production of artillery ammunition, could not ensure proper quality control. Many shells were filled with low-grade explosives or had faulty fuses. The Germans, sheltering in their deep bunkers, weathered the storm of fire. Colonel Fritz von Lossberg, who commanded one of the defensive sectors, later recalled, "We learned to determine the rhythm of British artillery. When the fire shifted deeper into our defense, we knew we had a few minutes to take up positions in the front-line trenches." By the end of the week-long bombardment, the British command was convinced of its success. Aerial photographs showed a cratered landscape where, it seemed, nothing living could remain. General Haig wrote in his diary, "The enemy's wire entanglements must be completely destroyed, and most of the defenders killed." However, the reality was quite different. German soldiers, sheltered in concrete bunkers, remained combat-ready. Their machine guns were undamaged. As soon as the British artillery shifted its fire deeper into the defense, German machine gunners took up their positions, ready to meet the attacking infantry. July 1st, 1916. A foggy morning over the Somme Valley. In the trenches, British soldiers checked their equipment, adjusted their helmets, and wrote their last letters home. At 7:30, the signals sounded. Thousands of officers' whistles shattered the morning silence, and a wave of 60,000 men rose from the trenches. They marched in even ranks, shoulder to shoulder, heavily laden, rifle, ammunition, grenades, shovel, flask, gas mask, dry rations. Many carried additional equipment: Lewis machine guns, field telephones, spools of wire. Each soldier carried up to 30 kilograms of gear. General Haig ordered them to attack at a slow walk, no more than 70 meters per minute. He mistrusted the fighting qualities of his recruits and feared that they would lose formation if they advanced quickly. This decision cost thousands of lives. When the first ranks crossed no man's land, the unthinkable happened. From German shelters, which should have been destroyed by a week-long bombardment, dozens of machine guns suddenly sprang to life. Streams of fire tore through the morning fog. British soldiers fell in entire rows, like mown grass. Captain Neville of the 8th East Surrey Regiment devised an unusual way to boost his men's morale. He handed out footballs, promising a reward to whoever first kicked a ball to the German trenches. None of the balls reached their target. The captain himself and most of his soldiers died in the first minutes of the attack. The fate of the Newfoundland Regiment was particularly tragic. Of the 800 men who went on the attack, only 68 remained in formation by evening. All officers were killed or wounded. The regiment effectively ceased to exist within 30 minutes of combat. In the sector where the 34th Division was advancing, German machine gunners allowed the British to approach within 200 meters and then opened a hail of fire. Soldiers fell so quickly that the survivors couldn't grasp what was happening. One officer recalled, "I saw my men dissolve into thin air. They simply vanished, struck down by an invisible force." Only in the southern sector, where the French and several British divisions were advancing, was limited success achieved. French artillery proved more effective and their offensive tactics more flexible. By evening, they had advanced up to 2 kilometers deep and captured the villages of Montauban and Mametz. By noon, General Haig was receiving conflicting reports from the front. Some commanders reported advances, others, catastrophic losses. Lacking a complete picture, he ordered the attacks to continue. This led to new, senseless casualties. By the evening of July 1st, it became clear that a catastrophe of unprecedented scale had occurred. The British Army lost almost 60,000 men in one day, about 20,000 killed and 40,000 wounded. This was the bloodiest day in the history of the British Army. Losses were particularly heavy among the volunteer battalions formed on a territorial basis. Entire towns and villages lost their young men overnight. In the town of Accrington, fewer than 200 of the 700 volunteers from the local battalion remained alive. The battlefield was a gruesome sight. Thousands of wounded lay under the scorching sun, many unable to move. Medics and stretcher-bearers worked tirelessly, but couldn't cope with the flood of casualties. Many wounded died of blood loss, never receiving help. The Germans were stunned by the scale of British losses. One German officer wrote in his diary, "I have never seen so many dead. They lay before our positions in neat rows, as if on parade. What made them march to certain death?" In the shadow of the artillery barrage and the bloody offensive of July 1st, the German defensive system on the Somme demonstrated its incredible effectiveness. This was not just a line of trenches, but a true engineering marvel, the result of painstaking labor and the strategic genius of the German command. As early as the autumn of 1915, the Germans began to create a defensive system on the Somme of unprecedented depth and strength. General Erich von Falkenhayn, understanding the limitations of Germany's human resources, developed the concept of elastic defense, a philosophy where concrete and steel compensated for the lack of manpower. The German defense consisted of 3 main lines, located 2 to 8 kilometers apart. Each line included at least 3 rows of trenches connected by hundreds of communication passages. The first line, which bore the brunt of the attack, was equipped with forward observation posts and light fortifications. The true strength of the German defense lay in the second and third lines. Here, concrete bunkers with walls up to 2 meters thick were located, capable of withstanding a direct hit from medium-caliber shells. Each bunker had an autonomous ventilation system, water, and food supplies. Some shelters extended up to 9 meters underground, housing barracks, ammunition depots, and command posts. The Germans paid particular attention to the placement of machine guns. The fire system was built on the principle of interlocking fire. Each section was covered by at least 3 positions. Machine gun nests were camouflaged in the natural landscape or placed in special reinforced concrete caponiers with narrow embrasures, making them almost invulnerable to artillery fire. Our fortifications were designed not to repel an attack, but to destroy it, wrote Colonel Max Bauer, one of the creators of the defensive system, in his memoirs. A key element of German tactics was the preservation of manpower during artillery preparation. When British guns began shelling, most of the defenders withdrew into deep shelters, leaving only observers. As soon as the artillery fire shifted deeper into the defense, machine gunners swiftly took up their positions. German engineering thought was also evident in the organization of anti-personnel obstacles. In front of each trench line were barbed wire strips 15 to 30 meters wide. The wire was fastened not to wooden stakes, which were easily destroyed by shells, but to metal spikes deeply embedded in the ground. After artillery shelling, such obstacles were not destroyed, but transformed into an even more impassable barrier of tangled wire. Natural heights and villages played a special role in the German defense. Each village was transformed into a veritable fortress, with underground passages connecting house basements and camouflaged firing points. The heights were used to locate observation posts and artillery positions, allowing control over vast areas. It was this defense system, created by German engineers and builders, that became a key factor determining the outcome of the first days of the Battle of the Somme. The British command, counting on the decisive effect of artillery preparation, failed to appreciate the true strength of the German fortifications. The result was the tragedy of July 1st, when thousands of soldiers died trying to overcome seemingly destroyed, yet fully functional, defensive lines. September 15, 1916, forever changed the face of war. In the pre-dawn gloom, on the battlefield of the Somme, something the world had never seen before appeared. Steel monsters, slowly crawling through the fog. They were called tanks, a code word originally used to disguise the true purpose of these machines during their transport to France. The name stuck, and the new weapon entered history under this simple and formidable name. The history of tanks began a year before their combat debut. In the summer of 1915, Colonel Ernest Swinton, impressed by the effectiveness of American Holt Caterpillar tractors, proposed creating an armored fighting vehicle capable of overcoming trenches and destroying machine gun nests. Winston Churchill, then First Lord of the Admiralty, enthusiastically supported this idea. Under his patronage, the development of the new weapon began in strict secrecy. The first tanks, designated Mark I, had a rhomboid shape with tracks covering the entire hull. They weighed 28 tons and moved at a speed of no more than 6 kilometers per hour, slower than a walking man. The crew consisted of 8 men who worked in unbearable conditions. Inside, the temperature reached 50 degrees. The air was saturated with poisonous gases from the engine, and the din was such that crew members communicated using gestures or notes. There were 2 modifications: males, armed with 2 6-pounder cannons and machine guns, and females, equipped only with machine guns. The armor, only 6 to 12 millimeters thick, protected against bullets but was vulnerable to artillery shells. Mechanical reliability left much to be desired. Out of 49 tanks sent to the front, only 32 reached their starting positions under their own power. The command placed great hopes on the new weapon. General Haig, initially skeptical of land ships, ordered 1,000 machines after demonstration trials. However, only a small number could be prepared for the September offensive. Before dawn on September 15th, the tanks took up their starting positions. The crews, many of whom were Royal Navy sailors who had voluntarily transferred to the newly formed Tank Corps, received their final instructions. The task was clear: to break through the German defenses, destroy machine gun nests, and clear a path for the infantry. When the tanks moved forward, the effect exceeded all expectations. German soldiers fled their positions in panic. "They were not machines, but devils," wrote one German infantryman. "We shot at them with rifles and machine guns, but the bullets bounced off like peas." When these monsters crawled over the trenches, crushing everything in their path, a primal terror seized us. Tank D1, nicknamed Diabol, Devil, by its crew, was particularly successful. It broke through German positions near the village of Flares, destroying several machine gun nests and clearing a path for the infantry of the 41st Division. British soldiers, following the tanks, advanced for the first time in many months without suffering catastrophic losses. However, the technical imperfections of the machines and tactical errors of the command prevented the full potential of the new weapon from being realized. By midday, most tanks were out of action due to mechanical breakdowns or stuck in shell craters. Several machines were knocked out by German artillery, which quickly adapted to the new threat. Nevertheless, the psychological effect was enormous. British soldiers were emboldened, seeing the Germans flee in panic from the steel monsters. The German command was forced to urgently develop anti-tank defenses, and military observers from all countries realized a new type of weapon had been born, capable of changing the nature of war. Above the fields of the Somme, the sky belonged not only to artillery shells. From the first days of the battle, its own struggle unfolded in the air, no less fierce and significant than the bloody clashes on the ground. Aeroplanes, these fragile creations of wood, fabric, and wire, became the eyes of armies, and a powerful weapon that changed the nature of war forever. By the summer of 1916, the British Royal Flying Corps had concentrated an unprecedented air armada on the Somme, 486 aircraft of various types. They were opposed by 129 German machines. This numerical superiority gave the Allies a decisive advantage in the struggle for control of the sky. The first and most important task of aviation was reconnaissance. British and French aeroplanes made dozens of sorties daily, photographing German positions from heights of 300 to 4,000 meters. Special cameras installed on board reconnaissance aircraft allowed for the creation of detailed mosaic maps of enemy fortifications. Up to 1,000 new aerial photographs were delivered to the front every day. "Without aerial reconnaissance, we would be blind," wrote General Rawlinson, commander of the British Fourth Army, in his diary. "Aerial photographs show us what is hidden from ground observers: the location of artillery batteries, concealed machine gun nests, reserve positions." Airborne artillery spotting was of particular value. Special spotter planes, equipped with radio transmitters, hovered over the battlefield, transmitting target coordinates and firing results to the ground. The observer pilot noted the splashes of shell bursts on a special grid map and sent signals to the artillerymen. "Short by 50 meters, overshot by 100 meters, target hit." The Germans quickly realized the danger posed by spotter planes and threw their best fighters to intercept them. Thus, a new type of aerial combat was born: the defense and attack of spotters. British squadrons, flying maneuverable Sopwiths and Nieuports, covered the unwieldy two-seater spotters from attacks by German Albatrosses and Fokkers. Over the Somme, organized fighter formations appeared for the first time in history. British ace Albert Ball and his comrades from the 60th Squadron developed tactics of patrolling in groups of 3 or 4 aircraft. German aces, among whom Oswald Bulka stood out, responded by creating the first specialized fighter units, the Jagdstaffeln. Bulka, a methodical and disciplined Prussian, formulated the famous Rules of Air Combat, which became the basis of fighter aviation tactics for decades to come. Always attack from out of the sun. Never lose sight of an attack once started. Fire only at close range and only when certain of a hit. The aerial battles over the Somme were particularly fierce. Young pilots from both sides displayed miracles of bravery and skill. British Captain James McCudden recalled, "We took off up to 5 times a day. Every sortie could be our last. but fear receded when you saw our lads below, going into the attack under heavy fire. We had to give them a chance. Gradually, air warfare became increasingly technological. Specialized aircraft appeared for various tasks: fast and maneuverable fighters, stable twin-engine bombers, reliable reconnaissance planes. Armament also improved. Synchronizers allowed firing through the rotating propeller, increasing the effectiveness of fighters. The Battle of the Somme became the cradle of air warfare tactics. It was here that the basic principles of aviation application, still used today, were born, achieving air superiority, reconnaissance, fire spotting, and direct support for ground troops. Airspace was transformed into a battlefield, just like land and sea. As the Battle of the Somme dragged on, both sides realized that old tactical methods were not working in the new conditions. The bloody experience of the first weeks of fighting forced command to seek innovative solutions. War became a laboratory of death, where new methods of killing and defense against it were born and tested. The evolution of tactics became a matter of survival for armies bogged down in the bloody stalemate of trench warfare. The British were the first to realize the fatal flaw in their initial tactics. After the disaster of July 1st, General Rawlinson, commander of the Fourth Army, abandoned the idea of massive frontal assaults. They were replaced by limited operations with clear, achievable goals. Instead of attacking along the entire front, the British began to deliver pinpoint strikes on narrow sectors, concentrating overwhelming firepower there. The most significant tactical innovation was the creeping barrage, an artillery support method in which fire gradually moved forward ahead of the advancing infantry. The artillerymen created a moving wall of explosions that advanced at a speed of 50 meters per minute, with the infantry following no more than 100 meters behind. This allowed German machine guns to be suppressed before the attackers reached enemy positions. "We learned to follow the wall of fire as a shield," recalled Captain Siegfried Sassoon. If you stayed close enough to the shell bursts, you could reach the enemy trenches before the Germans had time to take up positions after the shelling ended. The Germans, for their part, refined defensive tactics. General Fritz von Below, who took command of the First Army in the middle of the battle, introduced the principle of defense in depth. Instead of keeping the main forces in the forward trenches, the Germans began to place only observers and machine gunners in the first line. The main forces were in the second and third lines, ready for counterattacks. Storm groups played a special role in German tactics. Small mobile detachments of 8 to 12 men, armed with grenades, pistols, and flamethrowers. They operated autonomously, infiltrating British positions and attacking from the flanks and rear. Each group had a clear specialization: grenadiers, machine gunners, flamethrower operators, sappers. Flamethrowers, first used en masse by the Germans on the Somme, became a formidable psychological weapon. The jet of burning liquid, ejected up to 30 meters, caused panic among British soldiers. "There is nothing more terrible than seeing an approaching wall of fire," wrote British Lieutenant Robert Graves in his diary. "People ran blindly, preferring the risk of being shot to being burned alive." Both sides actively used mortars, weapons ideally suited for trench warfare. Compact, mobile, capable of indirect fire from cover, mortars became an indispensable means of hitting targets in dead zones inaccessible to artillery. The British Stokes mortar, developed in the midst of the battle, could fire up to 20 rounds per minute, creating a dense curtain of fire. Chapter 9. The Human Dimension of Tragedy. Life and death in the trenches of the Somme. In the letters and diaries of the soldiers who fought in this meat grinder, another dimension of war is revealed, not strategic or tactical, but deeply personal, human. Through their eyes, we see not just a military operation, but a tragedy that unfolded in the souls of millions of people thrown into the inferno of battle. "Dear Mother," wrote 20-year-old Private Arthur Hubbard to his mother the day before the attack on July 1st. "Tomorrow we go over the top. I am not afraid of death, but I am afraid of letting my comrades down. If you are reading this letter, it means I am no longer here." Arthur died in the first minutes of the offensive. His body was never found. Everyday life in the trenches of the Somme was a trial no less severe than the battles themselves. Soldiers lived in dirty, damp trenches up to 2 meters deep and about a meter wide. The walls were reinforced with sandbags, planks, and woven baskets. During rainy periods, which were frequent that year, the trenches turned into muddy ditches. Water stood ankle-deep and sometimes knee-deep. "We live like rats," wrote Corporal George Copson of the Leicestershire Regiment in his diary. "Rats, however, feel perfectly at home here. They are huge, the size of a cat, and completely unafraid of people. At night, they run across our bodies while we sleep. Some guys wake up to a rat gnawing on their hair." Poor sanitation led to epidemics. Trench fever, dysentery, and typhus mowed down soldiers as effectively as bullets. A particular scourge was trench foot, the softening and necrosis of foot tissues due to constant exposure to cold water. Thousands of soldiers were evacuated from the front due to this disease. Food at the front was monotonous and often insufficient. The staple diet consisted of canned beef, hardtack, jam, and tea. Hot food was delivered from the rear in special thermoses, but it often cooled on the way, especially in cold weather. "Our dinner is cold porridge with pieces of unknown meat," wrote German soldier Ernst Junger. "We call this dish the mystery in the thermos." Despite all the hardships, a special brotherhood was born in the trenches. Soldiers who shared dangers and deprivations formed strong bonds that were often stronger than family ties. "I have never been so close to people as I am here," confessed Lieutenant Wilfred Owen, who later became a renowned poet, in a letter home. "We know everything about each other. We have seen each other in moments of extreme weakness and extreme strength. After that, you either hate a person or love them like a brother." The psychological state of soldiers on the Somme became a subject of particular attention for medics. For the first time in the history of wars, doctors encountered a mass phenomenon known as shell shock, or war neurosis. Soldiers who had endured prolonged artillery bombardments exhibited symptoms not related to physical injuries: tremors, stuttering, loss of speech, blindness, paralysis of limbs, amnesia. Initially, military authorities considered this a manifestation of cowardice or malingering. Some soldiers were even shot for desertion. However, British psychiatrist Charles Myers, who worked at the front, proved that shell shock was a real psychological disorder caused by extreme stress. Thanks to his work, the first psychological rehabilitation centers for servicemen were created. "Man is not designed to withstand such tension," Myers wrote in his report. "The constant roar of explosions, the sight of mangled bodies of comrades, the unending threat of death, all this creates a burden on the psyche that exceeds its capabilities." In the shadow of the colossal strategic failure of the Battle of the Somme, individual dramas unfolded. Localized battles for villages, heights, and fortifications, where the bravery of individual units sometimes led to tactical successes. These small victories, paid for with the blood of thousands of soldiers, became bright spots on the grim canvas of the overall tragedy. Among such episodes, a special place is occupied by the storming of the High Wood and the adjacent villages of Ginchy and Comble. September 12, 1916. After a week of continuous rain, the Somme Valley finally cleared. Soldiers of the New Zealand Division prepared to storm the height they had nicknamed Heidenkopf, Heathen's Head. This hill, rising only 40 meters above the surrounding terrain, was of key importance. From it, the entire British line of advance was visible for several kilometers. Major General Andrew Russell, commander of the New Zealand Division, devised an unconventional attack plan. Instead of a traditional frontal assault after artillery preparation, he proposed a night attack without preliminary artillery bombardment. This was risky but offered a chance to catch the Germans by surprise. At 2 o'clock on the morning of September 13th, the New Zealanders silently advanced from their trenches. They moved in complete silence, guided by luminous compasses and pre-stretched guide ropes. The quiet rustle of hundreds of feet on the damp earth merged with the sounds of the night. Recalled Corporal Timothy Wallace of the Auckland Regiment later. The surprise attack was successful. The New Zealanders literally crashed into the German positions, finding the defenders asleep or playing cards. In hand-to-hand combat that lasted less than half an hour, the height was captured. By dawn, the New Zealanders had already entrenched themselves on the summit and repelled 2 German counterattacks. The capture of High Wood opened the way to the village of Ginchy, which was stormed by units of the 41st Division. Here, the British employed a new tactic, attacking in small groups under the cover of mortar fire. Instead of advancing in a solid line, soldiers moved from cover to cover, focusing on destroying individual strongholds. Quote, wrote Major James Darling of the Dorset Regiment in his diary, quote, "Bombardiers, specially trained soldiers armed with hand grenades, played a special role in the capture of Ginchy. They advanced ahead of the main forces, throwing grenades into German dugouts and machine gun nests. They were followed by riflemen who finished off the remaining defenders. The village of Comble, located 3 kilometers east of Ginchy, presented an even more difficult target. The Germans had turned it into a veritable fortress with underground bunkers connected by tunnels. This required coordination between British and French troops attacking from different directions. On September 26th, after 3 days of fierce fighting, Comble fell. French units of General Fayoul's 6th Army, advancing from the south, linked up with the British, who had attacked from the north. More than 1,000 German soldiers were captured in the cellars and bunkers, many of them demoralized and offering no resistance. These local successes had important tactical significance. The capture of High Wood, Ginchy, and Comble allowed the front line to be straightened and a foothold created for further advance. However, in the context of the entire operation, they remained a drop in the ocean. An advance of 3 to 4 kilometers on a narrow section of the front did not affect the overall strategic situation in any way. The Battle of the Somme not only changed the course of the war, but also became a turning point in the history of military medicine. Behind the front lines, another battle unfolded, for the lives of thousands of wounded soldiers whose fates depended on the coordinated work of the medical service. This system, forged in the fire of combat, became a model for all subsequent military conflicts. When thousands of wounded poured in from the front lines on July 1, 1916, the British Army Medical Service faced an unprecedented challenge. No hospital in history had received so many casualties in a single day. Medical personnel worked at the limit of human endurance, sometimes for 36 hours without rest. The system for evacuating the wounded had a clear structure. The first link was the stretcher bearers, former regimental band musicians trained to provide first aid directly on the battlefield. They carried the wounded from under fire, often risking their own lives. "We crawled between shell holes while bullets whistled overhead," recalled stretcher-bearer John Gilday of the Manchester Regiment. "The wounded cried out and called for help. We tried to reach the most severely injured, but there were so many that we had to choose whom to save first." The wounded were taken to advanced dressing stations, located a few hundred meters from the front line. Here, they received urgent care. Bleeding was stopped, tetanus antitoxin was administered, and simple surgeries were performed. Doctors worked in makeshift operating rooms, tents or semi-destroyed buildings, by the light of kerosene lamps, often under artillery fire. Next, the casualties were transported to field hospitals, located 5 to 10 kilometers from the front. Transportation was carried out by horse-drawn wagons, and later by specially equipped ambulance vehicles. It was here that major surgical operations were performed. Field hospitals consisted of complexes of tents or barracks, divided into departments according to the type of injury: abdominal, thoracic, craniocerebral, and limb. The best surgeons from Britain and France worked in the field hospitals. Many of them voluntarily left prestigious clinics to save lives on the front. Sir Anthony Bowlby, a leading surgeon at St. Thomas's Hospital in London, headed the British Army's surgical service on the Somme. Under his leadership, revolutionary methods of wound treatment were introduced. The Battle of the Somme became a catalyst for the development of military field surgery. For the first time, early surgical debridement of wounds, excision of damaged tissues followed by drainage, was widely used. This significantly reduced the incidence of infectious complications, which had previously been the main cause of death for the wounded. French surgeon Alexis Carrel and British biochemist Henry Dakin developed a method for treating wounds with sodium hypochlorite solution, which effectively combated infection. The Carrel-Dakin method saved thousands of limbs from amputation and became the standard for treating war wounds for decades to come. Craniocerebral injuries presented a particular challenge. American neurosurgeon Harvey Cushing, who voluntarily came to the Somme, developed new methods for removing metal fragments from the brain using an electromagnet. Thanks to his work, the survival rate of patients with penetrating skull injuries increased from 10 to 50%. After their condition was stabilized, the severely wounded were evacuated to rear hospitals. This was done using special ambulance trains, which ran between the front and the coast. Each such train could accommodate up to 400 wounded and was equipped with an operating room, a pharmacy, and a kitchen. Nurses accompanied the patients, providing assistance during transportation. On the coast, the wounded were loaded onto hospital ships, which transported them to England. There, they were distributed to specialized hospitals depending on the nature of their injury. Many aristocratic mansions were converted into medical facilities. In London alone, there were more than 70 such hospitals. Behind the front line, a battle no less important than the bloody clashes at the forefront was unfolding. It was a struggle against an invisible enemy, the logistical nightmare of supplying millions of armies with everything necessary to wage a long war. Never before had humanity faced a task of such magnitude: to feed, arm, and supply ammunition to hundreds of thousands of people, concentrated in a limited space under conditions of continuous combat operations. The figures for resource consumption on the Somme are astonishing. Daily, the British Army expended more than 2,000 tons of food, 1,000 tons of fodder for horses, 600 tons of ammunition on normal days, and up to 2,000 tons on days of active combat. Each soldier had to receive at least 3 liters of water per day. This meant the necessity of delivering over 1.5 million liters of water to the front line daily. The backbone of the logistical system was the railways. In the months leading up to the offensive, the British laid hundreds of kilometers of new tracks, connecting ports on the coast with the front-line zone. Dozens of new stations, unloading platforms, and warehouse complexes were built. Up to 40 trains with supplies arrived at the front daily. However, the railway could only deliver goods up to a certain point, approximately 10 to 15 kilometers from the front line. Beyond that began an area swept by German artillery fire, where train movement became impossible. Here, motor transport took over. At the beginning of the Battle of the Somme, the British Army had a fleet of almost 4,000 trucks. These were mainly 3-ton vehicles of the Thornycroft, Leyland, and Dennis brands. They plied between railway stations and intermediate depots, located 3 to 5 kilometers from the front line. To service this motor pool, repair workshops were established where thousands of mechanics worked, many of whom had worked in the automotive industry before the war. The last leg of the journey, from intermediate depots to the forward trenches, was the most dangerous and difficult. Here, animal-drawn transport and porters came into play. The British Army used over 100,000 horses and mules on the Somme. Each animal required about 10 kilograms of fodder per day, which created an additional burden on the supply system. A particular problem was the delivery of ammunition for artillery. Large caliber shells weighed up to 100 kilograms each, and their transportation required enormous effort. For transporting shells to heavy guns, narrow-gauge railways were laid with trolleys, which were pushed manually or pulled by small locomotives. The German logistical system, although in a more advantageous position due to its defensive nature, also faced serious challenges. The main problem was the depletion of Germany's resources due to the naval blockade organized by the British fleet. The Germans had to economize on everything, from food to metal for shell production. On the Somme, the German army created an echeloned supply system with main depots located in Cambrai and Saint-Quentin, cities 20 to 30 kilometers from the front line. From there, supplies were delivered by narrow-gauge railways and by convoys of trucks to forward depots, camouflaged in forests and ravines. The efficiency of the logistical system directly affected the combat capabilities of the troops. When in September 1916, torrential rains turned the roads into a muddy mess, the pace of the British offensive sharply decreased, not because of enemy resistance, but because of the inability to deliver sufficient ammunition to the front line. Water supply became a separate headache for the command. The Germans poisoned wells during their retreat, and natural sources quickly depleted with mass use. The British had to drill artesian wells and lay pipelines to forward positions. In critical situations, water was delivered in special tanks, or even in flasks tied to the backs of mules. By the end of October 1916, the Battle of the Somme was slowly fading, like a dying bonfire no longer fed with wood. Autumn rains had turned the battlefields into a boundless sea of mud. The ground, churned by millions of shells, absorbed water like a sponge, creating a viscous mire in which men, horses, and even tanks drowned. Soldiers on both sides now fought not so much against each other as against the elements, which had turned their trenches into water-filled ditches. Artillery pieces became mired in the soaked soil, making their movement impossible. Shells that fell into the softened earth often failed to explode, sinking deep into the ground. The offensive, which had advanced with such difficulty in the summer and early autumn, finally ground to a halt. British General Haig, stubbornly believing in the possibility of a decisive breakthrough, at last recognized the futility of further efforts. "Mud is our chief enemy," a commander of one of the British battalions recorded in his diary. Soldiers moved knee-deep and sometimes waist-deep in the sticky sludge. Many drowned in shell craters that had turned into deadly traps, deep holes with sheer, slippery sides filled with icy water. Delivering supplies to the front lines became an almost impossible task. Roads had disappeared under a layer of mud, making vehicle transport impossible. Horses and mules collapsed from exhaustion, trying to drag carts with ammunition and provisions. Often, the only way to deliver equipment was by porters, exhausted soldiers who carried everything necessary on their shoulders across miles of sodden ground. One British officer described it thus: "We live like prehistoric creatures in a primeval swamp. Every movement requires titanic effort. Men are exhausted just trying to get from one shelter to another. The war here is no longer against the Germans, but against mud, cold, and exhaustion. In early November, General Haig made a final attempt to advance, but it literally bogged down. Attacking units became mired in the mud, unable even to reach the German positions. On November 18, 1916, the cessation of the offensive operation on the Somme was officially announced. The results of the battle were staggering in their tragedy. Over 4.5 months of continuous fighting, the Allies advanced only 11 kilometers at the deepest point of the breakthrough, and only 5 to 7 kilometers along most of the front. This insignificant territorial gain was paid for with the lives of over 1 million people on both sides. British losses amounted to approximately 420,000 men, French losses to about 200,000. The Germans lost approximately 450,000 soldiers killed, wounded, and missing. Thus, every meter of recaptured territory cost roughly 100 human lives. However, behind the dry statistics lay profound changes in the nature of warfare. The Somme became a turning point, though not in the way the Entente command had planned. The German army, despite its stubborn defense, was exhausted by this battle. General Ludendorff later admitted, "The Somme was the first battle of material warfare, which showed the superiority of the Entente's industrial resources. We held out, but the price was immeasurably high." For Great Britain, the Somme became a national trauma. A whole generation of young men was mown down in this slaughter. Losses among officers were particularly heavy. Over 6,000 officers died, many of whom belonged to the country's educated elite. Some aristocratic families lost all their male heirs. The French perceived the results of the Somme with bitter irony. The original goal of the operation, to relieve German pressure on Verdun, was largely achieved, but the cost was so high that there was no talk of strategic success. The Battle of the Somme did not merely alter the course of the war. It transformed the national consciousness of entire countries, leaving a scar in the collective memory of nations that has not healed to this day. For Great Britain, France, and Germany, this tragedy became a watershed, redefining their attitudes toward war, authority, and human life itself. Each nation processed this trauma in its own way, filtering the horror of the Somme through the prism of its culture and historical experience. In Great Britain, the Somme became a symbol of senseless sacrifice and command incompetence. July 1, 1916, the day nearly 20,000 British soldiers died, became a national day of mourning. Entire towns and villages lost their young men. In Accrington, fewer than 200 of the 700 volunteers from the local battalions survived. The small Scottish town of Selkirk lost almost all its men of military age in a single day. The lost generation. That's what writer Gertrude Stein called the young people who perished in the trenches of World War I. Nowhere was this loss felt as acutely as in Britain after the Somme. Poet Siegfried Sassoon, himself a participant in the battle, expressed it in his bitter lines. His poems, like those of Wilfred Owen, Robert Graves, and others, became the voice of an entire generation that questioned the very idea of post-war British literature was permeated by the theme of the Somme. Robert Graves' novel Goodbye to All That and Eric Maria Remarque's depicted war without romantic embellishment, as a senseless meat grinder, pulverizing human lives. These books fostered the pacifist sentiments that came to dominate British society in the interwar period. Visual art also reflected the trauma of the Somme. Artists Paul Nash and Christopher Nevinson, who had been to the front, created series of works depicting ruined landscapes and maimed soldiers. Their canvases, with twisted trees and shell-cratered, waterlogged fields, became a visual embodiment of the nation's psychological trauma. For France, the Somme remained in the shadow of Verdun, their own national tragedy. Nevertheless, French society deeply experienced the consequences of the battle. Having lost about 200,000 soldiers, France faced a demographic crisis, exacerbated by overall war losses. This led to deep pessimism and fear of future conflicts, partly explaining the policy of appeasement in the 1930s. French literature and art reflected this trauma in the works of Henri Barbusse, Roland Dorgelès, and other authors who wrote about the war to end all wars. Their works, filled with bitter disillusionment, shaped public opinion and influenced political decisions in the interwar period. In Germany, the perception of the Somme was particularly complex and contradictory. On the one hand, the German army did not suffer a strategic defeat. It held most of its positions at the cost of enormous casualties. On the other hand, it was at the Somme that the Germans first encountered the superior industrial might of the Entente, foreshadowing their inevitable defeat in a war of attrition. German society was divided in its assessment of events. Nationalist circles created the myth of the stab in the back, betrayal at home, which allegedly deprived the army of a deserved victory. This myth, later exploited by the Nazis, distorted the reality of the Somme, presenting it as a heroic resistance of German soldiers against superior enemy forces. Another part of German society, represented by writers such as Erich Maria Remarque and Ernst Jünger, saw the Somme as a symbol of the inhumanity of modern warfare. Their works, especially All Quiet on the Western Front and Storm of Steel, depicted war without embellishment, as a machine of destruction, grinding human destinies. 100 years have passed since the last shots echoed on the fields of the Somme, but the lessons of that battle remain relevant today. This battle, which claimed the lives of over 1 million people, became a turning point not only in the history of the First World War, but also in the evolution of military art, political thought, and public consciousness. Looking back, we can draw lessons from this tragedy that will help us better understand the present and perhaps avoid mistakes in the future. The first and most obvious lesson of the Somme is the understanding of the true cost of war. Before 1916, European nations still held romantic notions about military conflicts. The Somme shattered these illusions. The scale of losses was so staggering that it changed the very attitude towards war. If military conflicts were once perceived as an inevitable and even glorious manifestation of national spirit, after the Somme, war came to be seen as an absolute evil that should be avoided at all costs. This change in public consciousness led to the emergence of pacifist movements in the 20s and 30s, and after the Second World War, to the creation of international organizations designed to prevent armed conflicts. The League of Nations, and then the United Nations, were a direct response to the horrors of the world wars, which began with battles like the Battle of the Somme. The second lesson concerns military strategy and tactics. The Somme demonstrated a fundamental shift in the nature of war, from maneuver warfare to attrition warfare, where victory is determined not so much by the military genius of commanders as by the industrial potential of the warring parties. General Ludendorff called the Somme the first battle of material warfare, recognizing that future conflicts would be won in factories no less than on battlefields. This lesson was learned by military theorists of the interwar period. Thinkers such as Basil Liddell Hart in Britain and Heinz Guderian in Germany developed concepts of mobile warfare designed to overcome the stalemate of positional fighting. Their ideas formed the basis of the Blitzkrieg doctrine and deep operations applied in the Second World War. The third lesson of the Somme is related to technological development. It was on the fields of this battle that tanks debuted, a weapon that radically changed the nature of land warfare in the 20th century. The first clumsy and unreliable Mark I machines became the progenitors of modern armored forces. The Somme showed that technological innovations can overcome a tactical stalemate if applied correctly. The air war over the Somme laid the foundations of modern military aviation. The principles of achieving air superiority, aerial reconnaissance, and close air support, developed in 1916, remain relevant today, although technology has advanced significantly. The fourth lesson pertains to the field of medicine. The need to treat a vast number of wounded with various types of injuries led to revolutionary changes in field surgery and the organization of medical care. Many methods developed by doctors on the Somme save lives in modern military conflicts. The system for evacuating the wounded, created by the British, became a model for the medical services of all armies in the world. The fifth lesson concerns the psychology of war. On the Somme, shell shock, psychological trauma caused by combat operations, was first massively recorded and studied. Today we call this post-traumatic stress disorder. The recognition that psychological wounds are as real and dangerous as physical ones was an important step in the development of military psychiatry and psychology in general. The sixth lesson is related to political consequences. The Somme and other bloody battles of the First World War undermined the legitimacy of Europe's ruling classes. People wondered, how could educated, cultured leaders allow such senseless slaughter? This led to profound political changes, the fall of monarchies, the rise of democratic and socialist movements, and in some countries, the coming to power of radical forces. Today, in the era of precision weapons and information warfare, direct parallels with the Somme may seem less obvious. However, the fundamental lessons of this battle retain their relevance. Modern conflicts, despite all technological differences, still require the coordination of various branches of service, logistical support, and medical assistance. And most importantly, they still lead to human suffering and losses. The memory of the Somme is preserved in memorials, museums, and literary works. Every year on the 1st of July, thousands of people gather at the memorial in Thiepval to honor the fallen. Engraved on this gigantic monument are the names of over 72,000 British and South African soldiers whose bodies were never found. They forever remained in the soil of the Somme. This memory is not just a tribute to the fallen. It serves as a constant reminder of what a combination of nationalistic rhetoric, militaristic ambitions, and technological progress unchecked by moral constraints can lead to. In a world where military conflicts continue and new technologies make weapons increasingly lethal, the lessons of the Somme remain vitally important for all humanity.